So I'm so thrilled to see all of you here at the Land Summit in Vancouver. The coming together of people to talk about these issues, is really I think part of the lifeblood of moving forward, of trying to find new solutions to housing precarity, to housing injustice. And so I don't know all of you here in the room. I know there's some old friends and hopefully some new friends, but I know that all of you are here because you care and you're doing a lot of work in this sector, and I just want to extend my appreciation to you for that. It's a bit wonky, hey? Because I'm too close? Okay. This is Noah, who is making sure everything works well. I want to just take a moment to situate all of us here. Some of us may be living or working on Coast Salish lands, but some of us may not. And this is really fundamentally a 3-day foray into land, and it's of course crucial that we think about land and the perpetuation of injustice that continues now based on the way that the law categorizes and requires use of land in different ways. We're on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. There's so much work that's being done by these nations, by Coast Salish nations, by urban Indigenous peoples on the very soil that we find ourselves in. And the talk that I'm going to give today is going to talk a little bit about how Canadian law thinks about those lands and how different First Nations in this area on Coast Salish lands are using legal structures to move forward with housing development. My name is Alex Flynn. I'm a professor at UBC in the law faculty. I work mainly on issues of housing precarity and homelessness. I'm fortunate to be the director of the Housing Research Collaborative, which is housing the Balanced Supply of Housing project. And you've met some of my wonderful colleagues already, as well as many of the people who are participating in the Balanced Supply of Housing. I'm the least important person in that whole collection of people, but I'm certainly very honored to be able to work with them. I haven't always been an academic, so I spent a number of years as a lawyer representing First Nations on their land-based rights and in ways that different First Nations could use their lands in ways that met the needs of their members, of their citizens. So it's very much with that background as an Aboriginal lawyer that I've moved into my role as an academic. I don't see these things divorced. I see them very much as a sort of continuation of the same goal, which is how do we move forward in a good way? How do we enable, as myself as a non-Indigenous person, how do we enable law to move forward in a good way? So the topic that I'm going to share a little bit about is First Nations land development in the Greater Vancouver Area. I'm going to talk for about 20 or so minutes and then open up a lot of room for questions. If I can figure out how this works. Oops, I'm moving in the wrong way already. Okay, so the project that this talk forms part of has been funded by the Balanced Supply of Housing. I'm working with some colleagues at the University of British Columbia, as well as a number of really crucial research assistants who provided the backbone to what I'm going to be presenting. Essentially, I'm going to follow a discussion on these different ways that land development can take place by First Nations, how First Nations can lead land development based on the kind of housing tenures that they have, what Canadian law says about this. So I'm not talking about Indigenous laws and the ways that First Nations structure decision-making and governance is outside the scope of this presentation, but super happy to talk more about what I know about that if that's helpful. So reserve lands are lands that are designated as such by the federal government. These are lands that have been allotted to First Nations under the Indian Act, which of course is a legal framework that has created a very unjust relationship between First Nations and the federal government. The First Nations get to have reserve land that's held by the federal government. The federal government is the owner of the land, and they own it for the benefit of the First Nation. And the First Nation can only make decisions in relation to reserve land that fit under the Indian Act, or there's been some pieces of legislation that have been introduced to modify aspects of the Indian Act, which include the First Nations Land Development Act and the First Nations Commercial and Industrial Act. But the fundamental relationship between the federal government and the First Nation is one of a power imbalance, in that the First Nation can only do what Canadian legislation allows them to do. The Treaty Lands Framework overrides the Indian Act, so it's basically an agreement that a nation can enter into with the federal government and other governments. And what this does is it removes the First Nation from the Indian Act altogether. It creates a new piece of legislation where the First Nation can hold the land subject to those new laws and rules. And I'll talk a little bit about an example of all of these things to animate it a bit more. Aboriginal title is something else. It's a designation that this land is held under and by the First Nation under Aboriginal title. It's a whole different kind of title. It's not fee simple title, which is a certain way of saying that land can be held. It's like a Canadian law invention. Aboriginal title is something different. It's still being figured out what Aboriginal title actually is and means. And there's a couple different ways that Aboriginal title can be held. It can be held based on a court decision where First Nation goes to court and says, we hold this land, we never gave it up. It's not reserve land, it's not fee simple land, it's our land, it's outside the scope of the common law, fee simple structure. Really hard to do that, going to court and getting Aboriginal title that way. That's one way. It's happened, but it's hard. The second way that Aboriginal title can be held is if a government says, this is held by Aboriginal title. So we have just received and seen some legislation that has done this in Haida Gwaii, if you've heard of that example, where the provincial government said Haida Gwaii is held as Aboriginal title. And that's still being worked out exactly what that means, but it's a totally different kind of title. And then the final is fee simple land. So this is what I alluded to before. This is, if anybody here owns a house or knows somebody who owns a house, that's how they own it. It is the biggest form of ownership that we have under Canadian law. There's very few limitations on it, and it means that the owner of that land gets to decide what is done with it, subject to bylaw rules, et cetera. But it's another way that First Nations can also hold land. They can acquire fee simple title, and I'll show some examples of how that looks as well. So these are the 4 different ways that First Nations can hold lands and make decisions and build housing on them, all of which are subject to different kinds of laws, and all of which enable different things. And I think what's really important about understanding and appreciating that is it's really complicated to be a First Nation. There's some First Nations, like the Squamish Nation, that holds all of, well, they don't have treaty lands, but they hold lands under a whole bunch of different legal frameworks. And so they have to abide by those different legal frameworks when they're making decisions. So it's really complicated. Okay, so the way that we, my colleagues at UBC and I, are trying to make sense of this or think of this is by calling into question the bundle of rights. I don't know if you've ever heard this. It's this idea that when you hold land, you have different kinds of rights related to it, and you have different kinds of responsibilities related to it. And these are some of the ways that the bundle of rights can be understood. It can be understood as giving you the ability to transfer it to who you want to transfer it to. So if an individual like myself, I'm fortunate enough to own a house, if I want to transfer it, I have a lot of reign over how I can do that, right? I can sell it, I can give it to somebody. I have a lot of ability to transfer it to whomever. Possession, who can actually be on that land? Who can be there, live there, use it? Who controls it? Who gets to make decisions for it? Who can be kept out of it? And then who can actually enjoy it? Who can come on with permission? So depending on the legal structure that exists, all of these aspects of the bundle will be answered differently in terms of how they each work. And so in a so-called normal development, meaning a fee simple development, this is how things look. You know, if you want to secure financing for a piece of land, that concerns how it can be transferred or how it can be possessed. Those are the foundations of whether or not you're going to be able to get financing in relation to land. You are saying, I have the right to acquire it, therefore I'm able to get financing, and I have the ability to possess it. I have the ability to do something on this. Those are the requirements that are going to exist in order to get financing in the first place. Then regulation, that's going to encompass as well decision making. So in order to make decisions for that normal parcel of fee simple land, you're going to have to show that you can make decisions for that structure that's going to be eventually put on the land itself. And then there's other parties that come into play in deciding who is kept out or who is able to use those parcels. Those are designated under Canadian law that's divided into federal, provincial, and municipal governments. So in the Greater Vancouver Area, we have all sorts of different kinds of zoning. So this is a map that's been created under another project. And what it shows is just all of the different kind of zoning that's permitted in the Greater Vancouver Area. This kind of zoning is based on fee simple title, right? So this assumes fee simple title. Whoever has that kind of normal title, this is the zoning regime that applies to it. And so the reason that we decided to start looking at the way that First Nations can hold land is because this zoning apparatus doesn't apply to some aspects, especially reserve lands that are held by First Nations. So we wanted to understand, well, how can First Nations, what are they forced to use in terms of legal frameworks? So once you move into the question of First Nations led development, the picture gets even more complicated because, for example, under lands that are held by the Indian Act, reserve lands, you can't use the same existing legal structures to develop those lands. You can only use the Indian Act, or you can only use the federal laws that have been passed that deal with what's going to happen there, unless there's been some kind of change. So all of these aspects of this bundle change too. Then it changed, so for example, under the Indian Act, there's big limitations on transferability. Reserve lands can't be transferred to non-citizens of that nation. There's limitations on who can make decisions, right? It's the band council that can make decisions, which is a different structure than under fee simple land. So it's really important for First Nations, if they're going to develop their land, to figure out what they can and can't do and how the laws might need to change in order to make that possible for them. And so in our project, we're looking at a bunch of different parcels that are all based on different ways of holding the land. This is a broad sort of overview. This is only the tip of the iceberg for the many different kinds of housing developments and lands that are held by First Nations. So there's a lot going on in the Metro Vancouver area that I think is providing examples for the rest of Turtle Island on what can be done in terms of First Nations-led development. So I'm just going to walk through a few examples, and then I'm going to turn it over to you with any questions that you might have or examples that you might have that brought you to this workshop in the first place, which I really hope happens, because it would be great to hear more about what you know about or any gaps that you have. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 developments which you might have heard of. The first is Sanok, which is, you can actually see the buildings coming up on either side of the Burrard Bridge in Kitsilano. I'm going to talk about Tuasin First Nation and the treaty lands that they hold. Lelem, which is a development that's a fee simple development that's taking place at UBC or near UBC, and then the Jericho Lands Project. All of these are structured differently. And I'm just going to give a snapshot of each because they're, as you can imagine, very complex in terms of their organization. Okay, so Sanok is on reserve lands. These lands were not given back to the Squamish Nation. Squamish Nation had to go to court and fight for years to get their land recognized as reserve lands after a series of dispositions that were made by the federal government in relation to them. This is a very hard-won, long battle that has taken place to acquire title back to them, to acquire reserve land status to these lands. And it's actually just quite a skinny parcel that's been given back to the nation as reserve lands, which explains the location upon which those towers are constructed. It's been decided by the nation that they are going to build a particular number of units for their citizens and for non-citizens. And they are the ones who are making the decisions about what happens on the land. It is their decision because these are reserve lands, and under the Indian Act, it's the Band Council who makes decision in relation to what happens to on-reserve lands, subject to all sorts of exceptions. Some things to note about Sanok. These lands are not subject to City of Vancouver bylaws, okay, unless the Squamish Nation agrees to that. So that means that parking requirements, setbacks, all the other kinds of bylaws that limit what kind of developments can take place, those are up to the Squamish Nation to decide what happens there. Sorry, I meant to show you this, this timeline. They are the ones who get to decide what happens there. There was a lawsuit that was started a couple of years ago by local residents of the very fancy Kitsilano area who objected to the fact that these lands were now going to have big apartment towers on them. They lost. The neighborhood association that brought this action lost because they brought it against the City of Vancouver, saying the City of Vancouver should object to this in more ways. And quite rightly, the court said the City of Vancouver has nothing to do with this. These are their lands. This is, if anything, it's the federal government because that's who the relationship is with, but it's definitely not with the City of Vancouver. However, it's important to mention 2 things. Number 1, in order to build those towers, there needs to be a framework, a legal framework. So why does there need to be a legal framework? Because there's banking implications, there is development implications. There's a whole, it's the thing that brought all of us here to this workshop in the first place, right? This conference in the first place. There's a whole set of laws that enable different forms of corporate structure, different forms of development, different relationships with funders that don't apply on reserve lands unless they are imported into that reserve through federal and sometimes provincial legislation. And that's what has happened on Sanok. It's what happened in other developments in the Greater Vancouver Area, like Park Royal. If you've been to that mall in West Vancouver, half of it is on Squamish land and half of it is on fee simple West Vancouver lands. So this structure was invented because the Squamish Nation needed it and the city of West Vancouver needed it in order to build that mall. So that's what led to this Canadian-wide change in legislation. And it enables Sanok to build the things that are there. So that's number 1 exception to this rule. Number 2, these apartments are going to need other kinds of infrastructure, sewage, plumbing, all sorts of local amenities. And for that, they need to enter into an agreement with a municipality. Super interesting area of development across the country, across so-called Canada, but also very interesting in the context of Greater Vancouver because of the ways that municipalities have limited First Nations from being able to develop on reserve, even if all the other things are in place, by saying things like, we're not going to give you sewage and water unless you make sure that our bylaws apply to your reserve lands. So that was a big part of the holdup in the development of Sanok, was figuring out how to have those amenities provided on reserve, okay? Okay, Tawasin, different issue. So Tawasin has a treaty land designation. They have a provincial act which sets out what the nature of that land is. It is fee simple land, but it is run and controlled by the Tawasin Nation, the Tawasin First Nation. And the Tawasin First Nation is a member of of Metro Vancouver, which is our regional municipal body. And they have been a member for a long time of that body. And part of the reason why is that they were one of the very early nations in Western Canada that created a self-government agreement. But what's important to note about Tawasin is that they have a complete code that figures out what can happen on their lands, okay, through this piece of provincial legislation that created the treaty with governments. And to know what can happen on the lands, you need to consult that act, and that act is going to tell you. This is a bit of information on how, really just a snapshot of how Tawasin First Nation oversees their lands and what some of the limitations in this sort of bundle analogy looks like. So for financing, the Tawasin Nation has created a development corporation, much like many other governments have done or entities have done. They have created a regulatory framework that its citizens have endorsed. And they continue to have some limitations on who can actually acquire and possess lands based on the use of leasehold title. So which means that the underlying fee simple title is always going to stay with Tawasin First Nation, but other non-members, non-citizens can acquire a leasehold interest in order to use or live in or purchase that property that's on Tawasin lands. So that's a very different kind of framework because it's made in Tawasin, right? The Tawasin Nation has a complete code that figures out based on what their citizens negotiated with governments on how lands can be used. It's not like anything else, what we would call in law like sui generis. It's unique to them how it's run. Unlike, say, the Indian Act, which is meant to apply to every single First Nation reserve land across the country. Leilem is an example of fee simple lands. These lands were the result of litigation as well, of a lawsuit as well, over a golf course that exists at UBC. Like many other, what has happened to many other First Nations, there was simply the colonial powers came in and just claimed those lands without any permission, without any right. And Musqueam, who are the land owners, the land stewards in this area, have always said right from the beginning, these are our lands, we never gave them to you, they're not yours. And what's interesting about the lands that Leilem sit on is that there's a parcel that the Crown, the government, never gave to any other entity. And so they've never been acquired by anyone else. So there's still the Crown still holds them. So the litigation that led to this ownership of Leilem was when the provincial government decided to try to sell part of the golf course. Okay? And so Musqueam Nation said, no, they're ours, you can't do that. The litigation was successful, and in the settlement, the parcel of lands that Leilem sits on, which is adjacent to the University of British Columbia, was part of the lands that were given to Musqueam or returned to Musqueam. These are fee simple lands. That means that the Indian Act doesn't apply, the First Nation Land Management Act doesn't apply. The same governing structures, legal structures that apply to every other fee simple lands applies to Musqueam in the development of these lands. What's super interesting, though, about Leilem is how Musqueam is developing them. So they are developing them in community based on the needs of Musqueam and non-Musqueam members, but in a different way. So for example, the way that the land looks, I don't know if any of you have been to Leilem, anyone here? If you look at it, it's different, the way that park space is used, the way that artwork is done, the way that gathering spaces are created, the way that amenities are available, what some non-Indigenous people would call like 15-minute cities or what have you, it's there. It's meant to be a community. Daycare spaces are part of the fabric of the structure of Leilem. And so it's a fee simple land, but it's being developed in a way that fits with Musqueam values on what they want to do, because they are the decision makers, they're the owners of this land. Owner is not always the best word or the word that all First Nations would want to use to describe their relationship, but they are the decision makers who get to decide what happens, and that's reflected in the built form and what's being done on those lands. One thing just to note is that all residential leases are subject, all habitation in Leilem is subject to a leasehold interest. So units are sold, but they're sold subject to this lease. Ultimately, they're held by Musqueam. Okay, they are the forever holder of the underlying title. But they are given owners, new occupiers of these condo buildings, of these residences, are given a leasehold interest. Okay, then finally I want to talk about Jericho lands. Jericho lands you won't see yet. It's still being in the process of being created. It's in the city of Vancouver. On your way to UBC, if you go, you'll see the big stretch of land which currently has an old army base and a very expensive private school. That is the Jericho lands, okay? And so half of it is owned by the Canada Lands Corporation or the Canada Lands Company, and half of it is owned by a development company, MST, Musqueam Squamish Tsleil-Waututh Development Company. So the three nations have come together, built a development company. They are acquiring different parcels of land around Metro Vancouver, including the Heatherlands and other lands, to develop them, to build housing, to build communities. And that's the same with the Jericho lands. Again, Jericho lands is built based on a different set of values around what this community is going to look like. It's meant to be a complete community. It's meant to have at least 30% affordable housing, including social housing. Interestingly, it is situated in one of Vancouver's wealthiest neighborhoods, and as you can imagine, a number of people living in the neighborhood are not happy about it, but MST and other First Nations leaders have been really working with neighbors to try to talk about and work in community. Ultimately, this will be a community that is part of that neighborhood. It will change the neighborhood, and they've been working to try to communicate. So from a zoning, any planners in the room would be super interested in how that process has looked. It's been a much more protracted process. There's been a lot of communication, a lot of community work to try to bring people along. Unlike Sanok, the decisions to create Jericho lands are not up to Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh citizens. They are subject to the zoning and other requirements of the city of Vancouver. So that changes the calculus a little bit. In terms of our bundle, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, we see that the way that the regulation looks is really different on Jericho land. So who can own it? Different. It's not reserve land. So that means anybody can own the residences that are ultimately created. Who can make decisions? I've talked a little bit about the role of the city. So it's a different structure that leads to ultimately different decisions. And that's, I guess, where I want to just sum up. Depending on the underlying, and thank you for your interest. My property law students are always like, what are you talking about? You're much more engaged, so thank you. Although I love my property law students. If you ever come across them, they're fantastic. The way that things can be done on land looks really different based on who has title to it. But it also, in the First Nations context, looks really different based on how that title is held, what kind of title exists. It changes what can be done on it. And for the work that we're all doing when it comes to CLTs, when it comes to co-ops, when it comes to the form of housing, I think it adds a whole dimension, like in particular those of us who are working in the area of Indigenous rights and thinking about how First Nations can create housing, how the structures that allow for the creation of housing can be done in a good way. Thinking about that underlying title, I think really matters. It can be a game changer in that bundle, right? Who can make decisions for it? Who can set the regulatory framework? So I'm going to end there, and I'd love to hear more from any of you. I have a mic here, which thankfully Dominique is going to turn on, because I'm sure I would mess it up. This is mostly for our friends who are online so they can hear the question. But please, any thoughts you have, any questions? Yeah.
I don't like using this, so I'm not using that. Sorry.
I'll paraphrase. Yeah.
It's just, it just sucks listening to this because I'm from the East Coast where our treaties are unceded lands, and it's a lot of land that's unceded. Our treaties are the most powerful in Canada, and it insults me when I see a modern treaty to turn this into a municipality. Because they're governing and they're dealing with our chief and council who are not our traditional leaders. Like, it's our clan mothers that are the leaders, but they're not being heard. They're not the ones at the table.
Totally.
So then when I hear about all this, it just makes me sad.
Yeah.
So it's more of a statement and not a question.
Yeah. No, that's 100% right. It's a very violent form of ongoing. Yeah, it's an ongoing. Sorry. Yeah, it's an ongoing violence, right? To lump, and what that means for who's given a voice and who's the so-called leader, especially when it comes to reserve lands, but all lands. Like, who's allowed to speak? Who's allowed to make decisions? It's a very aggressive, ongoing aggressive way to think about land and to think about belonging. So I think that's incredibly important. And I'm glad you said it, and I'm sorry.
It's okay. No, it's all right. I feel a lot when, like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's not just this,
yeah, no,
you know.
It's because I'm native, right? So I take this home with me. I live this.
Totally.
Right? So, yeah,
Totally.
It's a little different.
Yeah, totally. Maybe I'll just add one thing, which is, and I don't work for them, I don't know them intimately or what have you, but MST Corporation, the development corporation that I mentioned, that is part of the holder of the Jericho lands and Heather lands and other structures, that's a Canadian corporate structure. But the way, from my understanding, is the way that decisions are made is their own, you know? There might be a structure, but it's not reflective of what their values are. It's not the same as any other place. It's just its own way. But that tension between fitting in with the legal structure and being able to, you know, really work together in a way that fits Indigenous laws, like, that's hard. So, yeah. But that might be an interesting, I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being willing to share that. That's a huge gift to the room. And on that note, I felt like it would be better to prioritize any Indigenous voices in the room for reflection to yield. I just realized I have the mic, and that doesn't make sense for just like intellectual questions for you, which I can ask. But yeah, I just yield time if there's anyone who wanted the microphone instead for our learning space.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time today and explanation of some of Vancouver's. I often wonder, I'm from Vancouver Island. I come from Kusinich, and we're a matriarchal society as well. And I often ride through Vancouver with anger. And I get worried that the same people who are developing and making Vancouver bigger are going to look at the island and come develop our island. And we only have enough water, and it's my matriarchal duty to look after that water. And my voice isn't always heard. The other thing that I get really upset about is the Tsawwassen band. Those aren't they're all Indian Act imposed division of our people.
Yeah.
And they have a Sesu road, which is our language, sister language. Like, we have Sesu road on the island. And we can't go to Tsawwassen Mills and get tax-free, which isn't one of the most important things. But it's also sad that the way the government says, look at this, it looks good, you can do this. And that one time I heard that we were fighting over islands, and I'm like, that's all the Indian Act. It's all the Indian Act. The genocide is still in action. And that if they deter Tsawwassen from looking at who they really are, they won't even know that they have a Sesu road on the other side, and that our languages are sister languages, and make us forget about who we are. So when I see dispossession, it's not just dispossession of the land, it's dispossession of the language, the culture, the matriarchs, everything for the children. So the division happens in our communities as well. Yeah. And it turns out that our children are going east side, and the colors, and west side. It's like, you guys are all the same side. And that I think that I do a 40-minute presentation about the land acknowledgement, and a lot of it is about that, where black dots are where all our original communities were, and how the languages and the sisters and the culture were all related, and how we shared going to the same gatherings of memorials and namings and cultural things as such. Yet, when the Canadian government comes in and waves money, it divides our people. Yeah. And that even Musqueam, I have lots of cousins in Musqueam, and I'm from the island. But when the government looks at us, that doesn't count. Yeah. It just doesn't count for anything. That we're all my relations literally means all my relations. So I think that that's where I get disappointed in some of the divisions of the lands in this way, that on paper it can look good, but if you go to the courthouse, we're always against the Crown and Indigenous, every single day we're in the courts. And the last time I went to court, I got a lump in my throat because the judge was saying, and the law says, and the law says, and the law says. And I was like, whose law? You don't know our law. Yeah. And it doesn't align. They don't align. Totally. So how can they govern us when our laws don't align? Yeah. So, I don't mean to talk so long, but...
No, it's great. You can keep talking. Yeah. You should have given the presentation. It would have been so much better. Yeah. No, it's absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you.
I just arrived from Nova Scotia. I'm from North Preston, and North Preston is the largest and oldest Black community in Canada. Yeah. And we have significant fear. We are governed by fear right now in terms of the changing landscape in Nova Scotia and the very rapid expansion of our populace. And we're wondering where we're going to put people, because there's just so many people coming in to HRM, which is our municipality. And so here we are, the Preston Township. We have Lake Loon, Cherry Brook, North Preston, East Preston. We were put into those places to die, right? And now it's very veiled in terms of what the development plans are for the municipality to settle newcomers into Nova Scotia. So one of the things that we're looking to do, or that we have done, is forming a community land trust to protect ourselves and gain some transparency in terms of what's happening in our community. So the reason I joined your talk today was to learn a bit of how all of you are operating and moving in your, to figure out what best practices we can do and we can use to protect ourselves, because this is, I think we slept on it for a very long time, but if any of you have ever traveled to Nova Scotia or you've been to North Preston, you're seeing a community that is no longer deemed rural because it has a bus, but we have no access to condoms or a pharmacy or the morning after pill or emergency services or a gas station or a corner store. We have nothing. We have a still segregated elementary school and nothing else, right? Besides a recreation center. There's very little in terms of the amenities that any community would need to thrive. So I'm hoping to learn from Indigenous communities across Canada that are doing the thing, so that we can try and mirror how to get started and actually bring a safe, trusted, protected land for us, because we're living in fear.
Yeah.
And it's sad to feel like I'm in a room full of people who understand that feeling. It's like really heavy.
Yeah.
But I guess my question is, in terms of how do you kind of, 'cause there's only so many people that are willing to do the work. It's like very few of us that are, we don't have a recognized treaty. We don't have that. We're Black Canadians, and that's it. We don't have a recognized status. It doesn't matter how long we've been in Canada, right? So it's like everything's working against us. And because we're a Black community where there's little development, there's also little care as to what happens. So I don't know if I even have a question now that I said all that. I think I'm just venting. I'm going to pass this mic.
Yeah, vent. Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah.
Love the East Coast chatter.
you.
Maybe I can evolve it into something that resonates to Chinatown from North Preston, which also is what brings us to this room of I think a lot of us, we have Indigenous members of the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust. It's not so the idea that there are strictly Indigenous-led community land trusts and where Indigenous people are across the network of community land trusts is actually way more porous than I think how the government, as you guys say, perceives us all to be in these little boxes. But I think our question is what would, now that we can unpack the property system as a fictitious system that has increasingly more categories for you to invent more ways to invent jurisdiction over stolen land. What are the most hopeful elements that you've learned in your research, Alex, looking at people's attempts to actually return land to being land as opposed to property? And if there is because I know that Heather Dory's research also talks about what if we flipped those 5 in the bundle of rights against itself in a radical sharing, to radically share the ability to defend against trespass, to radically share those rights to defy the fee simple property right system. And that's a prompt from, I guess, Toronto's learning. But I'm wondering if you've heard and learned anything else across your research as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really so grateful for all of these reflections and observations and questions, but mostly the observations and questions and just what this actually is, which I always tell my, the first day when I teach property law, I'm property law is just about power. It's just, that's what it's about, It's not there's this, often students come in, never Indigenous students, but many other students will come in with this sense oh, the law is this thing, and it's the framing, that makes sense. And it's no, it's a framing that comes from assertions of power time and time and time and time again, that's recreated and recreated in order to advance the interests of those who have power. Patriarchal power, totally. So that's actually, I guess in terms of what what signs of hope or what, I mean, I think the truth is fundamentally it shouldn't be me giving this presentation, you know? I was fortunate to grow up in areas of Turtle Island that are where there's a lot of government infrastructure that means that First Nations can make decisions, that they govern. So that is how I come into questions of property law. But I am a non-Indigenous person, I'm a white person who is very embedded within these structures of power and even teaching Canadian law, you know, at a Canadian law school. So the things that I see as signs of hope are, to be honest, when a First Nation asterisk, because I'll just mention something, like it's when there's all that labor, all those decades and like centuries of pushing back lead to power. That's what I see as promising. But at the same time, even within that, it's like whose power, you know? And that's the hard part is, you know, exactly what you were saying about matriarchal power, you know? It's sort of like whose power, you know, what's the model being emulated? So I look at a lot of these examples and I'm like, that's really great that there's something different that's happening, that's informed by Indigenous laws. But I think just, you know, it might be that I'm like coming at that in a certain way. But I think it's when there's something different. It's when it's not different for the sake of difference. I mean, like Heather, turning things on its head. I think community land trusts are really exciting. I think what's going on in the downtown east side and across this country with respect to the momentum around community land trusts is exciting. I think it's great when churches give land back. I think land back is sexy. You know, that's what I think is exciting. I guess it's when power changes hands. And I think there are examples of that, but there's also more stories to them.
I just have a question. Which one of these, the reserve, treaty, self-governance, the title, or the Aboriginal title, or the fee simple, which one is closest to, like, if you're a lord or a lady or which is it the...
Like the crown.
Would it be the Aboriginal title? Because it's recognized by the law the same way that a landlord would have, like, would be the one collecting the taxes, delivering to the king, keeping the law and order, yada, yada.
I think...
Is that correct?
Yeah, they're all, like, we don't know enough about Aboriginal title is something really different. So it means that it's not, it's like a totally different paradigm for property.
So, like, it probably is the closest to that, but they just haven't nailed down the details because they want to make sure that it's the way that they want it or whatever.
Yeah, it's like, we don't know, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure probably.
But like, I guess I would take that question like, what emulates the British Crown the most? Yeah. And what emulates the British Crown the most is fee simple and reserve lands, because that's the way that the British Crown categorized or informed the categorization of land. So that to me is like King Charles, you know, beckoning.
But so what about one other question, kind of on the same thing? Okay,
yeah.
Those people that have that piece of land you were saying that got given back or whatever after fighting for a while and all that, but it's a corporation thing. So can they rescind that corporation and make a whole different one if they wanted to? Like if they made their own private society, they could actually rescind that corporation, make a new corporation, put themselves as the whatever, and then like structure that all how they want because they can now make a contract? Or would that be doable by them if they wanted to, or legally, or
probably? I guess it's like I would need to know more. Like a First Nation can decide to create a corporation and disband a corporation.
Right. Okay.
But if a corporation is holding land, then it can't just do that. You know, there needs to be some entity that's holding it. So it's
Right.
like those boxes. I think like there's all these boxes. So it's, yeah.
Just like the same way that the landed gentry would hold, because really they don't actually own it either, right? It's still the king or queen's.
Yeah,
whatever.
underlying title is in the Canadian context, Canadian law context.
So basically just getting, like abandoning all of that would actually be the better one, right? Because it'd be like actually land back.
Yeah, I think Aboriginal title to me points the most hopeful lens forward because it assumes something different.
Right.
It's sui generis. It is different. It's not like King Charles, you know, and so that means it can be something else.
So is it that maybe just a lot of people don't understand the actual legal structure of how the stuff works to where they're like, yeah, we need to get rid of that? You think? Or, I mean, I don't.
I think it's meant to be very complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that only certain people can like do things with it. Yes. Thank you.
Moving forward, as in your experience and knowledge, do you see more Crown land being restored to nations? And the second question would be, is there a limitation to the designation of that Crown land that could be restored to nations? And I'm thinking of national parks.
Yeah. So I think we're in the infancy for how we can, how we can think about different ways of imagining stewardship and relationships to land, right? So I look to places like New Zealand, which has its flaws, of course, where there's a requirement for a different relationship with iwi, with Maori, and it has led to other kinds of ways of imagining land, like personhood. So parks, that they are persons under the New Zealand legal imaginary, right? They're not just this stretch of land that somebody owns. It's like it flips the switch, the relationship. The parks or the rivers own themselves. And that is really, I think there's already a river in Quebec that has been deemed to be a person. The Fraser River has been deemed to be a person under Indigenous laws. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean for who can pollute those waters, or who can protect those waters, or who can? So yeah, but I'll tell you, those are still colonial structures, right? It's still like New Zealand law or Canadian law that is making or enabling, to a large extent, those legal categories. So there's a lot of work to be done to reimagine. It's not unlike what we're all doing here, right? We're taking a structure that's rooted in a legal framework, but saying, like, how can this look really different for people? And I think that's the question is, can we do that? How far can we do that? What are the same kinds of power issues we find ourselves in when that's done? But I think we're right at the cusp.
But restoration is the key, even if it's going to be fee simple, Aboriginal, or treaty, whatever it looks like.
I mean, it has to be, right? It has to be, because Canadian law sucks in a lot of ways, but one way that it sucks a little bit less is that there's a lot of case law that is saying not enough, and it hasn't had enough traction, but there's a lot of courts that have said the way that the Crown took lands was wrong, right? We have a section of the Constitution, which there's still room. There's a lot of nations trying to find room in that to have different kinds of relationships. So it's just there's also a lot of exhaustion from using the courts, and it's expensive, and it's time consuming, and it's generational of, is that where we want to be doing it? But yes, I guess the bottom line is yes, I think that is the way forward. Did you want to say, yeah?
I was going to mention that, like Facebook, there's a lot of misinformation, but one that I really thought I came across that I thought was silly, was the Mexican women were marrying the trees. They're starting from the tree and marrying this tree. And I was like, that's crazy. But I started reading and I was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. They were saving the forest from being cut down and making the tree human. And we do namings, and I wanted to name the old growth.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
they're just targeted all over BC, and they're very, very old trees. And even if you plant
profound.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Yeah.
I think that
yeah,
It takes extremism, right? And we're seeing that more and more and more to
Yes.
challenge
that's right.
laws that people don't understand because they're designed that way. It's a language that most people don't speak,
Yeah,
right? So to be radical and
Yeah.
to be extreme
yeah,
is the counteract to force the change that you need to see. Because not every community has, you know, whether they have a land trust or not, they might not have the funds.
Yeah.
They might not have the human capital or resources to do the work. You know, that it takes 50 years to develop this small thing. Things have to be pushed very quickly and radically so that we can actually enjoy them.
that's right. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but the examples that were offered today, those are all on the backbone of oppression, right? And pushing back. And nobody handed Squamish Nation Sanok. Like, no one handed them a legal framework to be able to do the work that they're doing. That is the stories of injustice are at the heels of that. And what seemed crazy, 20 years ago about this land is going to be ours, and we will make decisions for it, is our current contemporary challenge. I think I have to wrap up, right?
So we have one more question, and then we'll have to continue in the next break. Go ahead.
That's okay. Hi, my Nisga'a name is Sabach. I'm a hereditary chief of the Killer Whale House of Dakin, and my English name is Patrick Stewart, and I'm an architect. I happen to live on reserve, not in my nation, but out the valley, out in Stalo Nation. And when we bought our house, it couldn't be in our name because we're First Nations, and we had to form a corporation to own our house.
Yeah.
And it still owns our house, which is just totally crazy. And I don't know what's going to happen moving forward with that. I know there are communities now with land codes that you don't have
Yeah.
to go through all that.
Yeah.
But this community did not have that. And just participating last year with AHA, which is with the Venice Biennale, we had Architects Against Housing Alienation, and I was on the land back team, and we were pushing land back as far as we could, knowing that 90% of this country is held in right of the Crown. So we were saying Crown land is Indigenous land, has to be recognized like that.
Yeah.
My question is, how do we push that? How do we push that with government and say, you guys got to start recognizing this?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, the Everything Everywhere All at Once movie poster? It's like, that's I think what we have to do. Like, the courts are not enough. Advocacy is not enough. Being elected is not enough. Educating and just, pushing is not enough. But sum total of all of that, maybe that's enough, right?
Or we just go squat and just reclaim it back.
Yeah, just take it.
Yeah, and that's where I'm at now. Like,
Yeah.
It's enough is enough, like, because they're not just gonna give it back, so might as well take it back.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of,
Yeah.
that's actually like,
Speech tomorrow morning is from an Indigenous land trust in California that took a very,
yeah,
so we should
Yeah.
hear from them.
yeah. I think that's a perfect way to sum up our time together. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks, everyone,
So
and thank
grateful.
you, Alex. Thanks
Yeah.
for the exchange.
Thank you.